When wildfires closed in, the home of Big Shaq was left to burn, not by fate, but by choice. Racist firefighters arrived, stood still, and let history turn to ash. But what followed shattered silence across the nation. This wasn't just neglect. It was a spark that lit a movement, and what Big Shaq did next. That fire couldn't touch. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. When the wildfires roared over the ridges of Los Angeles that day, no one imagined they'd be met with indifference. Not when lives were at stake, not when one of the most recognizable figures in the nation stood on his own porch, eyes squinting into the haze, watching the creeping glow of destruction. Not when his name was Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, a man loved for his towering presence, and even bigger heart, a man who had earned millions, but who still remembered every hungry night of his youth. A man who had always believed that when disaster struck, help would come. But that day, help didn't come. It started as a distant rumble, too faint to unsettle. Big Shaq, dressed in his familiar casual wear, had just returned from a charity event across town. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, was out back in the garden, watering her prized tomatoes and humming old gospel hymns. His daughter, Mira, lounged on the couch with her phone, half watching videos, half lost in teenage boredom. His wife, Shawnee Henderson, was in the kitchen, planning their family weekend. The air was warm, calm, the kind that tricks you into thinking danger is far off. But then the smell changed. Smoke, not from a neighbor's grill or a distant barbecue, but thick, biting, and creeping into their lungs like warning fingers. Shaq stepped outside and saw the sky beginning to bruise orange and gray. His eyes scanned the hills, trained by decades of basketball to read angles and pressure. But even he couldn't make sense of what he saw. The fire wasn't just near. It was close. He didn't wait. Within moments, he was dialing emergency services, giving clear coordinates, stressing that his family was at home, and they were close to the path of the blaze. The voice on the other end was cold, mechanical, a woman who sounded exhausted and detached, as if she'd taken 1,000 calls already, and couldn't find it in her to care anymore. She acknowledged the fire, told him all units were dispatched, and advised them to prepare for evacuation. And then she hung up. There was no urgency in her voice, no promise of immediate assistance, just a subtle indifference that settled like ash in Shaq's chest. He didn't panic. Not yet. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he moved with quiet speed, alerting Lucille, calling out to Mira, who stared at the smoke-stained sky through the window with a dawning fear. Shawnee, ever composed, started packing essentials. They moved like a well-trained unit, like a family that had seen chaos before but never let it shake them. But then came the waiting. Outside, the sky dimmed. The fire advanced like it knew them personally. A predator that wanted to devour memories and walls and legacy. They could see the red blaze curling between trees, burning through brush, getting bolder with each gust of wind. And still, no sirens, no trucks. Shaq stepped outside again, phone pressed to his ear, trying every emergency line he could find. Some didn't connect. Some rang endlessly. Some delivered voicemail. Finally, after what felt like an hour of choking tension, a fire truck appeared down the drive. Red and white lights blinking, but not urgently. No roaring engine, no soldiers leaping into action. Just a slow, almost leisurely approach, as if they were out on a routine patrol, rather than responding to an active wildfire endangering lives. The first man off the truck was tall, broad like Shaq himself. But the resemblance ended there. His eyes were cold, unreadable, his demeanor laced with casual arrogance. His name tag read Henderson, and he approached like a man arriving late to a party he didn't care about. "You the homeowner?" he asked, without introduction or concern. "Yeah," Shaq said, extending a hand that was left hanging. "Shaquille O'Neal, thank God you're here. The fire's right on us." But Henderson just looked past him, eyes scanning the house as though evaluating its worth, not its safety. Behind him, the rest of the crew milled about with disinterest, one lighting a cigarette, another tapping on his phone. "We'll get to it," Henderson said, with a shrug. Shaq's jaw tensed. "It's on us right now. I've got my wife, my daughter, my mother in there. We need action, not words." Henderson glanced at him, his expression barely shifting. "You're lucky we came at all, Mr. O'Neal. We're stretched thin. Lot of calls tonight. Lot of places burning." The implication was clear. Not everyone deserves to be saved. Shani stepped outside, her tone sharp, eyes ablaze. What's that supposed to mean? Another firefighter chuckled under his breath. Guess even being rich doesn't get you special treatment. Shaq turned to him slowly, his voice low but firm. You think this is a joke? That's my family in there. But the man's smirk only deepened. Hey, we're just doing our job. Except they weren't. They didn't move. Didn't rush to deploy hoses. Didn't even assess the property. One aimed the hose lazily at a corner of the lawn, water dribbling in a useless arc. The others stood back, chatting, their posture saying everything their words didn't. And that's when Shaq knew. This wasn't just delay. It was dismissal. Lucille stood behind the screen door, coughing lightly, her eyes glistening with smoke and disbelief. Miara clutched her phone, trying to record what she could, but her hands were shaking. Shawnee whispered under her breath, "They don't care." Shaq felt something he hadn't felt since his youth. That aching, familiar sting of being unseen. Not as a celebrity, not as a millionaire, not as a father or husband or son, but as a black man whose cries were being met with shrugs. The fire crackled louder. The edges of the property began to light. The manicured palms burst into flame like torches. Still, the crew didn't budge. He tried to reason with them, even begged at one point, something he hadn't done in years. But they looked through him, around him, past him, until finally, Henderson spoke again. "Let it burn. Insurance'll cover it." And that was it. In those 4 words was the full weight of everything Shaq had feared. This wasn't about lack of resources. It was about value. Who mattered and who didn't. Not because of money. Not because of fame. But because of color. He backed away slowly, fists clenched, pride crumbling in slow, painful pieces. The house was beginning to glow from inside. The fire had found its way in. He turned back toward his family. There would be no saving the home. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because if the system had decided they didn't matter, then Big Shaq was about to remind them exactly who he was, and why staying silent was never an option. This wasn't just about a fire. It was about the match they'd lit the moment they chose to do nothing. And Shaq? He was about to burn the silence to the ground. The morning sun filtered through the massive glass windows of Big Shaq's hillside mansion, its rays splashing golden light across the hardwood floors like a soft promise of peace. The house stood like a fortress above Los Angeles, not just in size but in spirit, built not to flaunt wealth, but to protect legacy. The O'Neill residence wasn't simply a symbol of success. It was the center of gravity for a family rooted in love, shaped by resilience and surrounded by a calm that Big Shaq had fought hard to earn. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon waffles and fresh lemon polish. Shawnee Henderson moved gracefully through the kitchen, humming low as she poured juice into crystal tumblers, her movements fluid, unhurried, the kind of grace that came from surviving chaos and finally learning to breathe. Her rhythm was steady, built from years of raising kids, juggling expectations, and refusing to shrink under pressure. She glanced toward the hallway where faint giggles echoed, the sound of Mara teasing someone on FaceTime. Shawnee smiled. On the other end of the living room, Lucille O'Neill, tall, proud, and still full of fire despite her silvering hair, sat at the breakfast table by the window. She sipped her tea with the dignity of a woman who'd seen too much in her time to ever take quiet for granted. Her Bible lay open beside her, the pages soft from use, and her fingers traced verses like they were part of her skin. Every so often she'd look out at the backyard garden, eyes narrowing in satisfaction at the tomatoes she'd planted and nurtured like children. And Big Shaq? He was where he always was, when things felt right, barefoot on the back deck, cup of black coffee in one hand, overlooking the city below. The robe draped over his broad shoulders gave him the look of a retired warrior, at peace in his own empire. The sun lit up his face, and for a moment, it made him look younger than he was, not because the years hadn't come, but because the weight of them had finally lightened. He took a slow breath, letting the air stretch his lungs, feeling the heat of the wood under his feet, and smiled. The kind of smile that belonged to a man who had fought his way out of poverty, public pressure, broken bones, and media scrutiny, and still come out on the other side whole. A man who had always been larger than life, not just physically but in spirit, and yet it was this, the simple stillness, the warmth of home, that made him feel the most powerful. Inside, Mira danced barefoot across the living room floor, earphones in, half lip-syncing and half laughing at the messages from her group chat. Her laughter bounced against the walls, high and clear, and it filled every corner of the house with life. "Mom, Grandma's tomatoes are winning again," she shouted suddenly, peeking through the glass door. Lucille didn't even look up. "As they should, baby. Respect the soil and it'll bless you back." Shawnee rolled her eyes, mock exasperated. "You've been talking to those tomatoes like they're people again, huh?" Lucille sipped. They listened better than most. The house erupted in soft laughter, a harmony built on familiarity. It was this ease, this daily melody of inside jokes and gentle ribbing that defined their life now. No red carpets, no press, no headlines. Just the rhythm of a family deeply bonded by time and choice. Big Shaq stepped back in from the deck, his voice calm, deep, and warm. "Lucille, them tomatoes better not win again this season. You're already smug enough." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Boy, don't challenge what you can't defeat." Shawnee gave him a look. "You sure you want that smoke?" Shaq grinned and raised his hands in surrender.
All right. I ain't built for garden beef."
Everyone laughed again. There was a lightness in the house that day, the kind that can only exist when everything is quietly aligned. No threats on the horizon, no trauma knocking at the door. Just the hum of life going on, as it should. Later in the morning, Mira curled up beside Lucille as they watched old home videos on the big screen. Clips from when Shaq was still playing, dancing on court sidelines, doing those goofy commercials he pretended to be embarrassed about. "I still can't believe you did this ad," Mimara giggled, pointing at one where Shaq was in full gold armor promoting soda. "Were you serious?" Shaq groaned from the couch behind them. "A check's a check, baby. Don't judge me. You look like a glittery vending machine." Lucille cackled. And yet we drank the soda. The rest of the day unfolded in lazy waves. Shawnee ran errands, but came home early with fresh bread from their favorite bakery. Lucille spent the afternoon on the back porch, tending to her plants, radio playing Marvin Gaye. Shaq lifted weights in the home gym, then switched to the kitchen to cook dinner, his famous honey garlic salmon. Mira flitted between snapping selfies and asking Shaq for help with a project on resilience and role models. "You sure I count?" he asked. "You're the poster boy," she said, without looking up. Dinner that night was unhurried. They ate slowly, passing dishes between them, talking over one another in that unfiltered way families do when they know it's safe to be real. Lucille said grace before they began, her voice steady, her words soft but full. Mira shared bits of her school assignment. Shawnee cracked a joke about Shaq's plating skills, and he retaliated with a mock lecture on fine dining presentation. They laughed. A lot. There was no drama, no grand declaration, just a rhythm, steady and sure. But it was that steadiness that made what came next hit harder. Because peace doesn't announce when it's about to leave. It just slips away in a moment. That evening, after the dishes were washed and the sun dipped low behind the hills, they all gathered in the living room. Myra sprawled on the carpet with a bowl of strawberries. Shawnee curled up beside Shaq on the long leather sofa. Lucille sat in her corner chair, a quilt draped over her legs. The fire flickered gently in the hearth, not for heat, but for tradition. It was something they did every weekend. No screens, just stories. Shaq leaned back and exhaled. "Y'all ever just stop and realize how wild this all is? Where we started, and where we at now?" Shawnee nodded. "Every day," Lucille whispered. "God is good." Miara didn't say anything at first, just stared at the flickering flames. "Sometimes it feels too good." Shaq looked at her. "Too good? Like maybe the world's waiting to remind us that we're not supposed to have it this good for long." Shaq's expression softened. He leaned forward, clasping his hands, elbows on knees. "Baby girl, we earned this. Every second of peace we fought for. And yeah, life hits hard sometimes, but that don't mean we can't have joy while it lasts." Mira nodded, but her words lingered. Later that night, as the house quieted and each room dimmed into sleep, the stars above blinked silently over the hills of Los Angeles. The wind whispered against the windows, and the fire in the hearth finally died. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the fire that would challenge everything they believed about safety, about justice, and about who gets saved when the world starts burning. But for now, there was only this moment. The heartbeat of a family at peace, still together, still laughing, still whole. The wind changed first. It came sweeping across the hills with a sudden sharpness, different from the soft breeze that had carried music and laughter through the O'Neill household just hours earlier. It was dry, bitter, carrying with it something acrid, something old and dangerous. Lucille O'Neill paused mid-step on the back porch, her garden gloves half peeled, the hose forgotten in her hand. She sniffed the air and narrowed her eyes toward the horizon. There was a shadow crawling over the ridge. Not quite a cloud, not quite smoke, just a strange smudge on the sky. Inside, Shawnee noticed it next. She stood at the stove, stirring broth, when the light shifted in the kitchen. Gold to orange, orange to a dull bruised red. Her hands stilled over the pot. She turned slowly toward the large window and stared at the hazy streak of smoke bleeding across the skyline. Her heartbeat picked up. In the living room, Mayra's phone buzzed with alerts. Her school's community app had just posted a warning. Wildfire advisory in the area. Not an evacuation yet. Not official, but cautionary. She blinked at the screen and then bolted from the couch. "Mom? Grandma?" she called, her voice sharp with uncertainty. Lucille had already stepped inside, slipping off her gloves, the mud still clinging to her soles. "There's smoke," she said calmly, but her eyes betrayed the concern tightening in her chest. "It's close." Shawnee didn't hesitate. She turned the burner off, grabbed her phone and called for Shaq. He was upstairs, having just stepped out of the shower, a towel around his neck, when he heard the urgency in her voice echo up the stairs. By the time he reached the living room, the windows had become stained with the telltale orange that every Californian instinctively feared. Smoke now drifted visibly across the backyard. The hedges trembled under the wind, and the sky was no longer blue, but bruised and confused. Shaq's eyes scanned the perimeter of his property, the ridgeline behind the house now laced with creeping smoke trails. And somewhere beyond it, he could see the faint flickering pulse of fire. He didn't waste a second. Grabbing his phone, he called emergency services. The phone rang once, twice, then a third time. On the fourth it connected.
Los Angeles County Fire Services, what's your emergency?
Shaq spoke fast, but clearly. "We're up in the Beverly Glen Hills. Smoke is pushing toward our house. It's visible from the backyard. Flames are close. I've got my wife, my daughter and my mother here. We need a crew dispatched now." There was a pause on the other end. Then a sigh. "Sir, we're aware of fires in that zone. All units are currently engaged. Please monitor updates and evacuate if necessary." Shaq's voice tightened. "You don't understand. We don't have hours. It's already too close. We're doing what we can," came the clipped reply. "Please prepare to evacuate. We'll log your call." Shaq blinked. "That's it? You'll log the call? What am I supposed to do with that?" "Sir, we advise you to stay calm. Further instructions will be available through official emergency updates. Goodbye." Click. Shaq stared at the phone like it had betrayed him. Like the voice on the other end had reached through the line just to insult him with passivity. There had been no urgency, no humanity, just a cold recited protocol from someone who had clearly decided they didn't care who was on the other end of the line. He turned to the others. They said to evacuate if necessary. No units available. Logged the call. That's it. Shawnee frowned. Logged it? What does that even mean? Lucille moved toward the hallway, her movements brisk and practiced. It means we pack, now. Shaq nodded. He wasn't going to argue. But his gut churned. He'd been through enough in life to recognize when help wasn't coming. And this felt like one of those moments. Not just a system stretched thin. Something else. Something deeper. A shrug wrapped in uniform. The family moved quickly. Suitcases from the hallway closet. Emergency bags. Phone chargers. IDs. They didn't talk much. But the silence wasn't calm. It buzzed with worry. Mimara tried to stay light, joking about which shoes to bring, and whether she should grab her speaker. But her eyes kept darting back to the window. The sky outside had gone from eerie to terrifying. Smoke rolled over the hillside like war drums, and in the distance, a siren wailed. Distant, then gone. No trucks. Not yet. Shawnee gathered photo albums. Lucille grabbed her prayer books. Shaq threw on sneakers and kept one eye on the perimeter cameras from his phone. The backyard's feed was nearly blind with smoke now. Then came the neighbor's text. Shaq's phone lit up with a message from someone 2 streets over. Murphy's house just caught. It jumped the line. Get out now. He showed the screen to Shawnee, who paled. That's when the knocking started. Hard, frantic. He rushed to the door and flung it open. It was Linda, the middle-aged neighbor from 2 houses down, her face streaked with sweat and panic. Shaq, it's here. The fire. It's already at the Murphys. It's climbing up fast. You have to go. Her voice cracked on the last word. He nodded quickly, thanked her, and watched as she darted back into the smoke that had already begun to crawl through the neighborhood. Back inside, he clapped his hands loudly to gather everyone. We're leaving. Now. Car, let's go. They moved fast, grabbing only what was near. Lucille insisted on carrying a tiny framed photo of Shaq as a baby, despite his protests. It's been through worse, she muttered. As they loaded into the SUV, Shaq scanned the ridge one last time. The fire had reached the trees lining the top of their property. Embers floated down like evil confetti, and still, no fire truck, no flashing lights, no pounding boots, only silence and smoke. He climbed behind the wheel, his hands stiff on the steering. As he pulled out of the driveway, he looked once more in the rearview mirror. The house, their home, stood alone against a sky, now bleeding orange. Every window reflected the approaching fire, and as they drove down the winding road, all Shaq could think was, why didn't they come? And beneath that thought a second one began to smolder. Would they have come sooner if I wasn't who I am? The fire hadn't just reached their home. It had ignited something deeper, something personal, something unjust, and it was only getting started. The road twisted upward again as Big Shaq turned the SUV back toward the house. Smoke followed them like a ghost in the mirror, but he couldn't leave without trying one more time. He'd gotten the family out, safe and packed into a friend's driveway at the bottom of the canyon. Lucille had resisted leaving her garden behind. Mira had sobbed when they passed the basketball hoop she and her father had set up together just 2 months ago. And Shawnee, strong, silent, unflinching, had only said one thing: "You'll come back, right?" He'd not. Now he was here again. The smoke thickened as he pulled into the driveway. Trees crackled behind the property, glowing like dying stars. Embers danced across the lawn, and the heat shimmered in waves against the stucco walls of the house. His hands shook slightly as he reached into the glove box for the N95 mask he'd stashed there earlier. He pulled it on, stepped out into the murky haze, and glanced toward the hill where flames licked the top of the ridge, like wolves stalking prey. Then he heard it, the low grind of tires on asphalt. Relief broke through the tension in his shoulders as he spotted the fire truck rounding the bend. Red and white lights blinked half-heartedly through the smoke, and for a moment Shaq let himself believe they were finally here to fight. The truck stopped at the edge of the property. 5 firefighters hopped down, their gear clean, their expressions unreadable. They didn't rush. They didn't survey the property with urgency. They didn't move like people on a mission. They moved like they were clocking in for a routine shift. Shaq stared at them, his heart pounding with equal parts hope and confusion. One of them, a tall, bearded man with a grizzled face and a chest that puffed more with ego than effort, stepped forward. His name tag read Henderson. "You the homeowner?" he asked flatly, his tone devoid of emotion.
Yeah.
Shaq said, stepping forward. "Shaquille O'Neal. My family's out. The fire's behind us. Real close. This house, it's got maybe minutes." Henderson barely looked at the house. Instead, he squinted at Shaq through the haze and said, "We'll take a look." He turned and ambled back toward the truck like they had all the time in the world. Shaq followed, voice raised just enough to cut through the sound of crackling brush. "I don't think you get it. We're minutes away from the whole place catching." Another firefighter, a wiry man, with sharp eyes and a smirk that didn't belong in a crisis, lit a cigarette and leaned against the side of the truck. "Yeah, we get it, big guy." Shaq blinked. "Then why aren't you moving?" "Protocol," Henderson replied over his shoulder. "We assess before we engage." "But you're not assessing. You're standing there like—" Shaq paused, anger flaring, but still restrained. "Look, I called hours ago. No one came. Now you're here, and I'm begging you to act." A younger firefighter, no older than 25, snorted under his breath. "Mr. NBA thinks he's special." The words dropped like a hammer. Shaq's jaw tightened. He looked at each of them, at their posture, their disinterest, the way none of them seemed to look him in the eye. The fire wasn't the only thing in the air anymore. Something uglier lurked beneath the smoke, something colder than fire. Shawnee's voice rang in his mind. "You'll come back, right?" He took a breath, forced himself not to lash out. "This ain't about being special. It's about doing your job." Henderson turned slowly. "We've got people all over this city calling, a lot of them in real danger. But sure, let's focus on saving the NBA mansion." Shaq stared at him. That NBA mansion is my family's home. That's where my daughter was born. Where my mom lives. Where we've built everything we have. You think because I made it, I don't deserve to be helped? Silent. The younger one muttered again. Bet his insurance is fatter than our annual salaries. Shaq moved closer. Not threatening, but commanding. His height, his presence. All of it still monumental. Say that again. I dare you. The kid backed up a step, but Henderson raised a hand. All right, everyone calm down. We're gonna set up. Just don't expect miracles. There was no sincerity in his tone. Two of the firefighters retrieved a hose and started unwinding it. They didn't run. They didn't check the house perimeter. One of them aimed lazily at the edge of the yard, soaking patches of grass far from where the fire now approached. The flames were visible beyond the fence now, orange teeth snarling as they advanced. Shaq couldn't believe what he was seeing. That's not enough. You're just wasting time. Henderson shrugged. We're here. That's more than most get. The implication hung heavy in the air. You should be grateful. Shaq looked down the driveway, then back at his home. Memories passed through him like a reel on fire. Mira's first birthday in the backyard. His mom planting her first flowers in the garden. The way Shawnee danced in the kitchen when no one was watching. And these men were letting it all burn. Not because they couldn't help, but because they wouldn't. He clenched his fists, took a slow step back, and stared Henderson down. You got a problem with me, fine. But my family doesn't deserve this. My mother doesn't deserve this. My daughter doesn't deserve this. Henderson's smile was thin. They're not the ones making demands. Behind the truck, one of the crew laughed again, low and nasty. Let's be real. We all know what this is. What is this? Shaq asked, stepping forward. A lesson, the younger one said. About humility. A hose sputtered weakly. No real push. No pressure. Just an act. Shaq turned, walked back to the driveway, and pulled out his phone. The emergency services line rang again, and again. No answer. His chest tightened. Smoke began to seep through the vents of the house. Inside, the sensors would be flashing. If the fire made it to the garage, the gas line wouldn't hold long. He looked back at the firefighters still chatting beside their truck, still not taking him seriously. It wasn't about resources. It wasn't about protocol. It was about perception. Shaq wasn't just another man in need. To them, he was a symbol, a target, an opportunity to remind someone like him that his status didn't erase their resentment. Shaq stood frozen between two choices: explode and be branded aggressive, or walk away and be branded ungrateful. Neither would save his home. Neither would protect what was inside. He chose dignity. He walked away without a word. But inside, something had cracked. Not from the fire, but from the realization that he'd seen this before. In the league, in the media, on the streets, as a teenager. The same dismissal. The same quiet venom, disguised as authority. The same power game. Except this time, the price wasn't pride. It was his home. He stood on the driveway, smoke curling around his feet, as the flames grew bolder in the distance. The firefighters still stood idle. Shaq raised his phone again, not to call, but to record. The wind turned feral as it swept through the hills, feeding the fire with wicked precision. The orange glow now throbbed at the edge of the O'Neill property, like a living, breathing beast. The backyard trees caught first dry, brittle limbs, igniting in flashes of heat and light. Within seconds, the flames leapt toward the house, snarling through the perimeter bushes, licking the wooden posts along the fence. It didn't creep. It advanced like it knew no one would stop it. And no one did. Shaq stood frozen near the driveway, eyes wide behind his mask, phone gripped tightly in his hand. The screen showed a blinking red light. He was recording now. The firefighters, all 5 of them, stood in the exact same positions they had moments ago. One sat on the edge of the truck, lazily sipping from a water bottle. Another tossed pebbles at the curb like a bored teenager. The hose still dribbled in a sad arc that barely wet the corner of the lawn. Shaq's voice cracked through the smoke. The fire's inside now. You see that? The damn fire is inside the house. Henderson, the tall bearded man who'd led the crew, didn't flinch. He squinted through the smoke as if trying to decide whether the flames were real or worth the effort. You're just gonna watch? Shaq shouted, stepping forward. That's my family's home. That's their rooms, their memories. Are you really just gonna stand there? A murmur passed between 2 of the firefighters, followed by a slow shake of the head and a dismissive scoff. Henderson looked at Shaq, that same cold, amused expression plastered across his face. "You got money, don't you?" he said. "Call your contractor." The comment hit Shaq like a slap. "This ain't about money," Shaq said, barely holding back the rising emotion in his throat. "This is about doing your job. That's what you swore to do. You think my family's life is less important because I've been on TV?" One of the younger firefighters chuckled behind his mask, the sound muffled but unmistakably cruel. "Look at him," he muttered, begging for help with a 10-bedroom house behind him. "What's next, gonna cry for the cameras?" Shaq stepped back as the heat surged toward him. His voice trembled now, not from fear, but disbelief. "You're enjoying this. You're actually enjoying this." Another firefighter shrugged. "We showed up. That's more than some people got tonight. And you think that's enough?" Shaq snapped. "You think standing here while it burns makes you heroes?" Henderson's smirk deepened. "We've got bigger priorities. Real people with real emergencies. You're just mad the world doesn't bend for you anymore." Shaq's fists clenched, not from anger but from restraint. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw something, break something, shake the universe into noticing what was happening here, but he couldn't. Not here. Not like that. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, he already knew this wasn't just negligence. It was punishment. He turned and looked at the house. His house. The living room windows were glowing now. Flames dancing behind the glass, like they were mocking him. Curtains curled into black ribbons. Smoke belched from the vents. The roof groaned under the weight of heat and time. "Please," Shaq said, softer now, desperation rising like the smoke. "There's still time. You can still save it. You can still do the right thing." Henderson raised a brow and nodded toward his team. "All right. Turn the hose." They did slowly, and without urgency. The stream arced across the lawn again, barely grazing the nearest bush, now a torch in itself. The water hit the fire with all the force of a whisper. It hissed, sizzled, then disappeared. "You call that trying?" Shaq asked, his voice rising once more. A shrug from one of the others. "Like I said, miracles? Not in our job description." He looked back toward the house again. Smoke was now billowing through the roof. The patio furniture melted into itself. The basketball Mara left on the back steps had caught flame and deflated with a small, pathetic pop. Shaq's phone buzzed. It was Shawnee. "What's happening?" He stared at the screen for a long moment, before answering. "They're here, but they're not really here." There was a pause. Then her voice cracked. "Are they doing anything?" He couldn't lie to her. "They're letting it burn." He ended the call and turned his camera back toward the firefighters. Zoomed in on the blank faces, the idle hands, the refusal. He moved slowly, deliberately, capturing everything. The flames, the laziness, the smirks. And then, quietly, he said, "This is gonna be seen. You think you can erase this? Pretend this didn't happen? You're wrong. You're so wrong." One of the firefighters, the youngest, turned slightly and said, without shame, "Bet the internet loves a crying millionaire." The sound of shattering glass behind them snapped all heads toward the house. The living room window gave way. Fire poured out like it had finally been unshackled. A wave of heat pulsed outward and struck Shaq's chest like a blow. Still, none of the crew moved with urgency. Lucille's chair was in that room. Her favorite blanket still draped over the backrest. The Bible she read every morning probably sat on the table by the window. Pages now ash, words lost to smoke. The weight of it crushed Shaq's chest. Everything they'd built. Everything they loved. Not just burning, but being allowed to burn. And the worst part? They were powerless in the face of it. Not because they weren't capable, but because others chose not to care. The betrayal was total. Shaq took a few steps back, until he stood at the edge of the driveway. His eyes didn't blink as he watched the inferno claim his family's history. He kept filming, silent, steady. A few minutes later he heard new sirens, real this time. Louder, sharper, more trucks approaching. He turned toward the curve of the road, but it was too late. The house was gone. The crew that had arrived first stepped aside, cleared the path like nothing had happened, like they weren't complicit in the loss. The second crew rushed in, different uniforms, different urgency. They began dousing what was left, trying to save the trees, the neighbor's property, the land that still hadn't surrendered. Shaq didn't speak. He didn't move. One of the new firefighters approached him gently. "You all right, sir?" He nodded once. The motion stiff. "They let it burn. The man looked past him at the crew packing up lazily near the truck. His expression tightened, but he said nothing. Shaq turned off the camera. Then he walked back to the SUV parked on the side of the street, the taillights blinking in the smoke. Shawnee opened the door before he even reached it. Her face pale, her eyes searching. Mayra sat in the back holding Lucille's hand, tears streaking her cheeks. Shaq climbed in, shut the door softly, and didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because they all knew what had happened. They just couldn't believe who had let it happen. The morning after the fire was eerily quiet. Smoke still drifted across the charred remains of what once was the O'Neill family home, settling like ash-covered fog across the scorched driveway. Blackened palm trees leaned at unnatural angles, their trunks gutted by flame. The garden Lucille had spent months nurturing had vanished, burned into dust and soot. What had once been a house full of laughter, movement, and memory was now a hollow skeletal frame standing in silence like a monument to failure. Shaq stood at the edge of the property with his arms crossed tightly against his chest. He hadn't said much since the night before. His jaw clenched and his eyes, red from both smoke and sleeplessness, scanned the wreckage like he was still trying to find something to salvage, some proof that this had all been a bad dream. But there was nothing left, not even denial. Then came the sound of engines, low at first, then unmistakable. Dozens of news vans poured in, reporters and cameramen spilling out with mics raised and cameras rolling. Word had spread quickly, not because of who Shaq was, but because of how the fire had been allowed to win. A few bystanders had already posted the early clips to social media. Shaq's footage recorded in anger and disbelief was already making its rounds. And then there was the quote, "They're letting it burn." It was raw, unfiltered, and undeniably damning. By the time the media reached them, the footage had gone viral. Platforms were exploding with outrage. Activists, athletes, everyday citizens, everyone had something to say. And the only thing louder than the firestorm was the silence from those in power. "Mr. O'Neill, what happened here?" one reporter shouted, as she jogged up the driveway, microphone extended. Shaq remained still, eyes fixed on the blackened roof beams. It wasn't that he didn't hear the question. It was that answering it felt like giving it too much credit. But beside him, Shawnee stepped forward. Her hair was tied back. Her voice was steady, not because she wasn't shaken, but because she refused to be anything else. "The people who were supposed to protect us did nothing," she said, the words clear, measured, cutting. "They came, they stood, and they watched." The crowd of reporters quieted slightly, sensing the gravity of her tone. A few lenses zoomed in. A few pens paused over notebooks. "They didn't move with urgency," she continued. "They didn't assess the situation. They didn't listen. They dismissed our fear, and they dismissed our family." One reporter asked, "Are you suggesting this was intentional?" Shawnee didn't blink. "I'm not suggesting, I'm telling." All heads turned as Shaq finally stepped forward. His frame blocked the early sunlight, casting a long shadow across the ashes at his feet. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and steady. "Race played a role." The silence that followed was thicker than the smoke. Every mic pointed his way now. Every reporter leaned in. "They didn't see me as a man asking for help. They saw a black man they didn't like, in a house they didn't think I deserved," he said. "They didn't forget to help us. They chose not to." He glanced back at the burned remnants of their home. "And they need to answer for that." Another reporter asked, "Do you have proof of the firefighters' behavior?" Shaq looked directly into the nearest camera lens. "It's all on video. I recorded everything. Their words, their inaction, their smirks, and now the whole world will see it too." The questions didn't stop. They multiplied. But the answers from the O'Neills stayed consistent, firm, honest, and deeply composed. Later that day, the footage Shaq had taken was released publicly. It was posted from his official account with a single caption, "They watched it burn." The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it trended across platforms. Hashtags began appearing. Justice for Shaq, protect every family, firefighter accountability. Celebrities reposted the video. Activists cited it during public discussion. Thousands of people shared stories of emergency neglect, racism in response services, and systemic failure. It wasn't just about Shaq anymore. The incident had become symbolic, a flashpoint in a country already boiling from buried injustices. News anchors debated the implications live. Footage of the fire juxtaposed with the crew's inaction was looped on national broadcasts. One viral segment featured the soundbite of a firefighter muttering, "Bet his insurance covers more than we make," over footage of flames swallowing a child's bedroom window. The public was not kind. Protests formed outside local fire stations. Activist groups demanded an independent investigation. Civil rights attorneys called the incident a textbook case of deliberate neglect under racial bias. Petitions spread with thousands of signatures calling for the suspension and prosecution of the responding firefighters. Shaq and his family remained mostly quiet in the days that followed, choosing their words carefully, allowing the footage and reactions to speak louder than outrage. But the pressure didn't ease. Reporters camped outside their temporary residence. Offers poured in from media outlets, talk shows, and influencers, all asking to amplify the message. Behind closed doors, the O'Neills wrestled with what came next. Lucille paced quietly in the guest room. Mira barely spoke for 2 days, her phone filled with classmates' messages and viral clips she wished she hadn't seen. Shawnee made lists, relief contacts, legal advisors, repair estimates. But he stayed at the window, scrolling through the messages he received from strangers. Some encouraging, some hateful, some gut-wrenchingly familiar. There was one that stopped him cold. It read, "Same thing happened to my mom's house last year. They came late and didn't even try. She wasn't famous, so nobody believed her. Thank you for saying it out loud." That was the shift. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a pattern. And now, it had a spotlight. The Los Angeles Fire Department released a carefully worded statement that evening. It claimed the department was reviewing the incident, and that firefighters responded as best they could under extreme conditions. They cited multiple active fires that evening and called Shaq's experience deeply regrettable. But public pressure had already turned the tide. Activists flooded city council meetings. Civil rights organizations began drafting legal motions. Local officials were forced to address the growing outrage in front of the cameras. And while Shaq didn't rush to respond, he made one final post before nightfall. A short video, no dramatic music, no editing, just him standing in front of the charred ruins of his home. His voice was calm, centered, controlled. "I'm not speaking out for sympathy. I'm speaking out for accountability. What happened to my family is part of a much bigger problem. This isn't about fame. It's about basic human dignity. If this can happen to us when we had resources, visibility, and a platform, imagine what happens to the people without those things. Imagine what gets buried. Not anymore." He paused. "We didn't lose our home. We were failed by those meant to protect it." And the screen faded to black. The response was immediate. Tens of thousands of reposts. National news coverage. Statements of solidarity from athletes, musicians, community leaders. One NBA star posted, "Shaq's always been bigger than basketball. Today he proved it again." But with the support came resistance. Comment sections filled with denial, defensiveness, and racial dog whistling. Maybe they were just overwhelmed. Everything ain't about race. Why does everything have to be political? Shawnee watched it all, with weary eyes. "We expected this," she said one evening, her voice low. Shaq nodded.
Yeah.
But now they've seen it. The world can't unsee it. The betrayal had been public. So would the reckoning. Shaq's phone buzzed. The subject line was simple. "Security footage, you need to see this." He opened it without much thought, expecting condolences or a viral tweet someone wanted him to repost. But as the attachment loaded, his shoulders stiffened. The video began from a neighbor's security camera, mounted high on a garage across the street, the wide angle perfectly capturing the front of the O'Neill residence. The fire truck could be seen pulling up, the crew stepping out, leisurely. The clock in the corner ticked through a full 15 minutes, as the fire visibly grew behind the house. Then came the voices. Clear. Unfiltered. No guesswork. "That he thinks we're gonna roll out the red carpet. That's Shaq, right? NBA royalty too good to wait like the rest of us. You know what, let it burn. He's got backup mansions." Laughter followed. A short pause. Then a more sinister comment. "Bet if that was a white family's house, we'd be crawling all over it already." Another laugh. Another sip from a coffee cup. No urgency. No guilt. Just contempt. Shaq didn't say a word as the video ended. He simply turned the screen to Shawnee. She watched. Once. Then again. By the time she looked back up, her eyes were rimmed red, not from tears. She'd shed plenty, but from fury cooled just enough to cut cleanly. "This changes everything," she said. And she was right. The footage wasn't hearsay. It wasn't accusation. It was proof. Undeniable. Unambiguous. Time-stamped, recorded, preserved. What had been brushed off as speculation or emotional exaggeration was now a documented violation of duty, ethics, and humanity. Shaq forwarded the email to his assistant with a simple subject line: "Find me a fighter." By nightfall, they had her. Valerie Brooks had never lost a discrimination case. A former federal prosecutor turned civil rights attorney, she had a reputation for dragging institutions into the light. Clean-cut, steel-eyed, and articulate in a way that made opponents stutter. She didn't come to negotiate. Their meeting was brief, but electric. "I don't want an apology," Shaq said, seated across from her in the private room of a downtown legal office. "I want accountability." "You'll get both," Valerie replied, flipping through the video transcript without looking up. "But we're not going to the city. We're going to the nation." The next step came quickly. A formal complaint was filed, citing gross negligence, racial discrimination, and misconduct under the Uniformed Emergency Response Code. The complaint named all 5 firefighters individually, and the department collectively. But Valerie didn't stop there. She released the footage to national media with a statement that was as deliberate as it was devastating. "This is not just about a burned home. It is about the dehumanization of Black families during crisis. This is a fire department that showed up and made a choice not to help." The reaction was immediate. News channels played the video on loop. Editorials spilled across op-eds, condemning not just the individuals, but the culture. Talk shows invited legal experts, civil rights historians, and even retired firefighters to weigh in. Some defended the crew, citing stress, exhaustion, or protocol. But the footage kept playing, and the truth drowned the excuses. By the weekend, protesters had gathered outside the Los Angeles Fire Department headquarters. The sidewalks overflowed with homemade signs: "Justice for the O'Neills," "No protection, no peace," "Fire them all." Chants echoed across the plaza, punctuated by speeches from local leaders and national advocates. Shaq didn't attend the first rally. He wasn't ready. But he watched from the living room. Miera curled under his arm, Lucille humming quietly behind them. Valerie stood on the courthouse steps, addressing the crowd like a general before battle. This family did everything right. They called early, they followed directions, they got out, and their reward was humiliation. Their punishment was silence. "This isn't a scandal, it's a symptom." One reporter approached Shawnee later that day for a comment. She didn't hesitate. They didn't fail at their job. They chose not to do it. And now we're choosing to speak up. The case became the top national headline. Other families came forward. Not celebrities, not athletes, just ordinary people who'd once been told their emergencies weren't a priority. A woman in Oakland, who lost her apartment in a fire while responders took nearly an hour. A father in San Diego who recalled firefighters chatting while his garage burned. The narrative evolved. It wasn't just about Shaq anymore. It was about the system, the weight of accumulated apathy. Civil rights groups filed amicus briefs. A coalition of public defenders released a joint letter supporting the O'Neills' legal case. Meanwhile, local government officials scrambled to mitigate the fallout. The mayor issued a public apology. The fire chief was placed on administrative leave. Henderson and the other 4 firefighters were suspended pending investigation. But for Shaq, the apologies meant little. It was never about public gestures. It was about culture, about the deeply rooted perception that some lives didn't warrant urgency. One night, weeks into the media storm, Valerie came over with updates. Depositions had been scheduled. The city was considering a settlement offer, a quiet payout to make it all go away. Shaq listened, arms folded. "We're not settling," he said. Valerie nodded. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Shawnee placed a hand on his arm. "This isn't just about our family. It never was." That same night, Shaq posted again. It wasn't a long video, just his voice over images of the burned house, the protests, the video footage. At the end, his words echoed. "Some things you don't walk away from. You face them, not because it's easy, but because too many others can't." The post hit millions of views overnight. The comments were a mix: rage, support, deflection. But the tide had already turned. This was no longer a tragedy. It was a reckoning. Inside, the mood was different, sterile, tight with tension. The gallery was full long before proceedings began. Activists, community leaders, victims of similar negligence, journalists from across the country, and quiet supporters of the O'Neills packed the benches. their silence louder than any chant outside. Shaq sat beside Shawnee, both of them composed but firm. He wore a navy blue suit, understated but sharp. His expression was unreadable. Minora sat behind them next to Lucille, whose eyes hadn't left the courtroom doors since they'd arrived. Valerie Brooks, sharp as ever in a tailored black blazer, organized her notes, her gaze steady on the front row where the defendants sat. There they were, Henderson, and the 4 other firefighters. No uniforms now, just suits that didn't quite hide the tension on their faces. Henderson's jaw was locked tight. The smirk from that night had long vanished. The judge entered. The bailiff called for silence. And so, the trial began. Valerie rose first. She wasted no time with pleasantries. Her opening statement was precise, grounded, and direct. "This case is not about what the fire destroyed," she began. "It's about what human beings allowed to happen, about a choice, a conscious, deliberate decision to ignore the cries of a family in need. Not because of capacity, but because of prejudice." She turned briefly toward Shaq and his family, then back to the jury. "This isn't a case about resources. You'll see they had the tools. You'll hear they had the time. What they lacked was empathy. What they lacked was duty. And as the evidence will show, they didn't just fail their job, they betrayed it." The defense rose next. Their strategy was clear: overwhelm the jury with logistics, terminology, and tactical doubt. "This was a night of chaos," the lead attorney argued. "Multiple fires, limited manpower. Our clients responded as best they could, under impossible circumstances. They didn't discriminate. They triaged, they prioritized. And yes, sometimes decisions hurt. But they weren't malicious." But the tide began to shift. As the evidence unfolded, Valerie started with the video, the same footage that had gone viral. The courtroom lights dimmed as it played on a mounted screen. The jury's eyes fixed on every frame. They watched the truck pull up, the crew disembark slowly. They heard the laughter, the comments, the indifference. "Let it burn. He's got insurance." If this was a white family, gasps rippled through the room. One juror visibly recoiled. Valerie didn't say anything immediately. She let the silence speak. Then she called her first witness, a fire chief from a neighboring district, brought in as an expert. "What's your response time policy during a Tier 3 wildfire?" she asked. "Immediate assessment within 5 minutes of arrival," the chief answered. "Hose deployment within 7 if conditions allow." "And how long did the defendants wait before engaging?" He looked down at his notes. 17 minutes, minimal water deployment, inactive posture until a second team arrived. "Would that be considered standard?" He looked up. "No, ma'am, that's dereliction." Next came the digital forensics expert. He walked the jury through the department's internal communications emails and chat logs pulled from official firefighter tablets and devices. One message from Henderson read, "Can't wait to see Shaq's face when we roll in late." Another, "Don't rush. He's had his whole life easy." Valerie circled back to the moment captured on the neighbor's security cam. "These are not exhausted men," she said. "These are men reveling in power." This was not a mistake. It was a statement. The defense scrambled to recover. They brought forward character witnesses, other firefighters who described Henderson as tough but fair, and his crew as professionals under stress. But on cross-examination, Valerie disarmed them effortlessly. "When was the last time a black homeowner in your precinct received an emergency response under 10 minutes? Silence. "How many complaints have been filed against this team in the last 5 years? Objection. The defense barked. Sustained, the judge replied, but the question lingered. Then came the testimonies from those who'd watched it all happen. Linda, the neighbor who had warned Shaq, recounted the night with trembling hands. "They didn't even move," she said. "It was like they didn't care. I've never seen firefighters look so passive." Another neighbor described Henderson laughing as the roof collapsed. "They weren't fighting a fire," she said. "They were watching a show." Each word added another brick to the wall, closing in on the defense. But it was Mira's testimony that broke the room. She stood with her shoulders back, voice steady. "I watched them through the window. I was scared. I kept asking my mom, why aren't they helping? I still don't have an answer." Shawnee followed, delivering her statement like an indictment crafted by grief and fury in equal parts. "You teach your kids that if something's wrong, you call for help. That help came to our door, looked us in the eyes, and decided we weren't worth it." Finally, Valerie gave her closing. "No family, famous or not, deserves to be punished for who they are. This was not about the house, it was about what that house represented to those men. They saw a black family living in success, and they decided to remind them who held the power. The defense countered with a technical breakdown, trying to reduce the trial to operational misunderstandings and unfortunate optics. But the room had already decided. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty. A collective breath swept the gallery. Guilty of negligence. Guilty of misconduct. Guilty of discrimination. Shaq closed his eyes. Not in triumph. In release. The judge sentenced the firefighters to immediate dismissal from their posts and recommended a federal review of the department. Civil penalties followed, significant financial damages awarded to the O'Neills, and an independent oversight body established to monitor emergency response practices across the city. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric. Valerie stood with the family, flanked by supporters, media, and activists. Shaq took the podium last. This verdict isn't just for us. It's for every person who's been told they don't matter. For every call ignored. Every life dismissed. We didn't ask for special treatment. We asked for equal response. And today, the system was forced to listen. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters chanted in celebration. News anchors scrambled to summarize. But for the O'Neills, it was a quiet victory. Because the truth was, the fire didn't destroy them. It revealed them. And now, nothing could hide what had been seen. The sun crept slowly over the charred hills of Beverly Glen, its light casting long, quiet shadows across land that once held memories, laughter, roots. What had been a vibrant family estate was now an open plain, flattened, cleared, solemn, not forgotten, not erased, but transformed. Where fire had once devoured every beam and memory it could touch, construction markers now dotted the soil. Faint outlines of a blueprint traced over blackened earth, like the beginnings of something reborn. Big Shaq stood at the edge of it all. Silent beneath the morning sky, in his palm rested a smooth, dark stone, engraved with 6 simple words, "From ashes we rise." Its weight was deceptive, light in mass, heavy with meaning. Behind him, a handful of workers began the early stages of rebuilding. Machines humming, blueprints rolled out across the tailgate of a pickup. But Shaq wasn't watching them. Not yet. His eyes were on the ground beneath his feet, on what used to be the heart of their home. He knelt slowly, the way a man does when honoring something greater than pain. He dug a shallow groove in the soil and gently pressed the stone into the earth. For a moment, his hand lingered there. He didn't say anything aloud, but something passed between him and the land, like a vow, like a promise whispered without words. Behind him, Shawnee approached, holding 2 coffee cups. She handed one to him and looked down at the buried stone, then at her husband. "You picked the right words," she said softly. "They picked themselves," Shaq replied, rising to his feet. "We just had to live through enough to hear him." For weeks after the trial, their family had moved with quiet resolve. The media coverage had roared for days, then faded into its usual churn. The verdict was on every network. But it wasn't the verdict that lingered. It was the footage, the faces of those firefighters, the raw clarity of Mara's voice in court. Their story had done something. It had unsettled people, awakened others, and sparked a broader fire, one that couldn't be extinguished by headlines alone. They knew the moment would pass unless they gave it shape. So they did. It started around the kitchen table of their rental house. The one with thin walls and 2 small bedrooms, but a lot of heart. Mara brought it up first, half nervous, half inspired. "We should help other families," she said one night. "Ones who don't have cameras, or lawyers, or us." Lucille nodded from across the table. "We got the chance to speak. A lot of folks never do." Shawnee scribbled notes. Shaq listened, and something new began to rise inside all of them. Not just grief repurposed, but purpose itself. The Phoenix Fund was born 3 weeks later. Its mission was simple in words but powerful in impact: to provide direct assistance to families affected by disaster and to advocate for equity and accountability in emergency response services. What started as an idea became a structure, and what became a structure quickly became a movement. Within the first month, they secured office space in South LA, not far from where Shaq had once slept on borrowed couches before fame found him. The location mattered. It wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. The communities most affected by slow or absent emergency response were usually the least resourced, least heard. Shawnee took lead on infrastructure, partnering with nonprofits, managing fund distribution, ensuring every dollar was accounted for. Lucille organized outreach, building relationships with community centers, churches and displaced families. Mira, despite her youth, took to advocacy like she was born for it, designing the fund's social presence, speaking at student panels, launching awareness campaigns with the blunt honesty only a teenager could wield. And Shaq, he became the face of it, but never the ego. He wasn't just the name on the letterhead or the celebrity at the gala. He met with families in fire zones, sat in their broken living rooms, held their hands. He listened. He asked, not what do you need, but how can we make it right? Donations poured in, some large, some small, all fueled by the same shared belief that this wasn't just about rebuilding houses, but restoring dignity. Their first official grant helped a single mother in Northern California, whose home had burned while responders redirected resources to wealthier neighborhoods. Another family in Arizona, ignored during a flash flood emergency, used Phoenix Fund aid to rebuild and access trauma counseling. In Baton Rouge, the foundation funded a mobile disaster response unit for overlooked Black communities during hurricane season. Every story they touched added another spark to the fire they were stoking. A fire of accountability, of compassion, of structural change. Soon, the fund was more than reactive. It was proactive. Valerie Brooks, now part of the advisory board, worked with Shawnee and civil rights attorneys to draft policy recommendations, response time audits, mandatory racial bias training, civilian oversight for departments receiving state funds. Legislators took notice. So did departments. Some pushed back. Others changed. The ripple became a wave. At a Phoenix Fund town hall event, Shaq stood before a packed auditorium, flanked by his family. This all started because someone looked at us, he told the crowd, and decided we weren't worth the effort. But we are. You are. Every single one of you. The room erupted. That night, Mira came to her father, tears in her eyes, joy in her voice. You turned the worst night of our lives into something real, Dad. Something that's changing people. Shaq hugged her tight. No, baby, he whispered. We did. Months passed, then seasons. The blackened plot of land where their old home had stood slowly transformed. It wasn't rebuilt the same, not out of fear but intention. The new home would include a community meeting space on the first floor, open to local organizations and disaster prep workshops. It would have a resource library, a room for families to gather when displaced, and a memorial wall, not just for what was lost, but for what was born from it. On the day the first foundation beam was laid, Lucille stood next to Shaq, one hand on his shoulder. God knew what he was doing, she said quietly. Shaq nodded. Hurt like hell though. Growth always does. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the canyon ridge, casting a warm orange glow across the wooden frames of their new beginning, the whole family gathered once more. No speeches, no cameras, just them, together. Shaq walked to the garden. What would be the garden again? He knelt down, pressed his fingers into the soil, right where the stone had been buried weeks earlier. He brushed the surface until the words emerged once more. From ashes we rise. He didn't need to say it out loud. It was already understood. The fire had taken their home, but what it gave them in return, the resolve, the mission, the movement, was something fire couldn't touch. And this time, they weren't just rising. They were lifting others with them. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Stand with those still waiting for justice when the sirens never come. Share the fire. Not the tragedy, but the truth behind it. Because change doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts with who we choose to care about. And today, you get to choose.